at everything. In fact, what we do not know and cannot do far exceeds what we do know and can do. Did you ever notice that? What we do not know and cannot do far exceeds what we do know and what we can do. I mean, I'm marginally successful in certain areas of life. Does that make me an expert on everything? No. I mean, society teaches that. Ever seen an athlete who is excelling in his profession? Did that make him good perfect at everything else in life? Well, we've seen that proven to be wrong. Or a politician or anyone else in a position of authority and leadership? No, it doesn't make us perfect. In fact, I'll just confess, I'm not good at fixing things up. I'm just not good with power tools. If I'm going to redo our bathroom, I'm not even going to begin that project. I'm going to do this. I'm going to call the professionals in, pay them the money, and have them do it. Because I'm not a fixer-upper. I'm a unfixer-upper. In fact, this way, when my family sees me with a power tool in my hand, they get all nervous right away. My daughter's like, Dad, put the drill down and back slowly away, Dad. Because it's like, what are you going to mess up? You see, I'm not perfect at that. I'm not good at it. And it's only the prideful person who thinks they don't need help. It's only the prideful person who tries to hang on to the sense, well, I've got to do it. I'm Mr. Fixer-Upper. And then 3 weeks later, they're calling somebody for 4 times the amount because they've messed up the plumbing. It's pride. You see, I want you to understand, it happens in very subtle ways in our life, in our attitude, in our relationship. And Jesus redefined status, and Jesus demonstrates selflessness because Jesus came all the way down and wrapped himself in our humanity. It's only the proud person who thinks they're an expert at everything. It reminds me of the story of the 4 guys in an airplane. The pilot and 3 others, passengers. One passenger was a seasoned pastor, an elderly pastor. And another passenger was this very distinguished professor. He was brilliant professor, well known in his field. And the third man was a backpacker who was backpacking across the country. But they were on this plane together, this small plane. And about halfway through the flight, the pilot leaned back and said to the other passenger, we've got a problem. He said, these engines are failing. This plane's going down. And he said, I got a second problem. There are 4 of us and 3 parachutes. He said, my plane, I get one of the parachutes. And with that, he strapped one on his back and he jumped out of the plane. And then the brilliant professor spoke up and he said, listen, I'm brilliant. I can't be lost in this plane. The world needs me. Everyone looks to me for answers. I'm honored and revered. I can't die in this plane. I'm too important to society. And with that, he straps one of the backpacks on his back and he jumps out of the plane. Just the elderly pastor and the backpacker sitting there. The elderly pastor looks to the young man and says, young son, I've lived a long life, and in a few moments when this plane goes down, I know where I'm going to spend eternity, and so I want you to have the last backpack. And the backpacker said, sir, that won't be necessary. And the pastor said, well, son, why is it? He said, sir, you know that brilliant professor? He just jumped out of this plane with my backpack on his back. His backpack. 2 parachutes left, no problem. You see, sometimes we can be so smart. We are to not think more highly of ourselves than we ought. In our lives, when we take a posture of being someone of importance, I wonder sometimes about this, and it can creep up in the most subtle ways. I remember when we moved into the building that we're in at the King's University. It's renovated from our previous church building. It's a beautiful building. And I remember that when we were finishing the project, I asked them, I said, I'd like to have a parking spot right near the entrance to the offices, of course. And so I said, I don't want my name on it and things. I don't want that. But if you would just put a sign there that says reserved, and I would appreciate it, and that way I'd always have a parking spot. And so they did. And then I remember we were in the building about a month or so, and I came back from a meeting off campus, and when I pulled in the parking lot, there's ample parking, but when I pulled in the parking lot, there is someone parked in my parking spot. I had to park, get this, I had to park another 15, 20 feet away in another parking spot. I went inside the building and, I was a little irritated by that. No, I have parking space. It says reserved for me. And I walked in. I just happened to take a note of it, and I mentioned it to my assistant. I said, oh, by the way, I had a very kind, matter-of-fact voice. I said, there's someone parking in my parking spot. Do you happen to know whose car that is? Oh. And they went, she said, I don't know. I said, oh, okay, no problem. And I went in my office. And about 5 or 10 minutes later, one of our staff members stopped by my door. Said, Pastor John said, hey, I just moved my car. I'm so sorry. I wasn't thinking, and I was rushing. I'm so sorry. He was so apologetic, so sorry. And I said, no problem. And then he walked away kind of with his head down. And I sat there in my chair, and the Lord, I just sensed the Holy Spirit say to me, you arrogant pastor president. Who do you think you... And I felt so bad that I had... And this is what I thought. Why did I have to say something? What was it in me that felt... it's a little thing, but it's not so little. I thought, what was it in me that felt... I had... Okay, so you park in another spot. What do? You go into your office and you go to work. Why did I have to say something? But sometimes in our life, when we feel like, do you know who I am? Do you enjoy being around people that demonstrate a sense of pride or arrogance in your presence? Does that make you endeared to them? Does that make you want to be with them more? You want to spend more time with them? You ever been in an office building or in a business or have a job where your boss always looked down on you, always demanded certain things of you they didn't demand of themselves? Ever been in a situation where you're always criticized and condemned? It was trying to tear you down so somebody else could build you up. Ever have a friend like that who wasn't really a friend unless you could do something for them? Ever have a time in your marriage where you just felt like you were taken advantage of and you were really there not to be honored, but to be taken advantage of? To be there just to do things for your spouse. Ever have a situation like that? You see, Jesus demonstrates humility because humility is attractive. In our society, people are drawn to those who demonstrate authentic, not false humility, authentic humility. Those who are willing, like this trip coming up to Costa Rica, when you're willing to leave the comfort of your home and of your city to go to another country and spend some time ministering to the poor and feeding the hungry and caring for the sick and bending the knee of surrender and of humility. When you do that, it says something about you. It says that you're not too good to care for someone who in society's eyes are lower on the ladder. God has called us to redefine our world, our city, by redefining our home and our workplaces, by redefining our relationships, by taking on the attitude of a servant, not just a servant, a slave, and not just a slave, a crucified slave. Finally today, the third point, we'll close. Jesus not only redefines status and demonstrates selflessness, Jesus embraces submission. Embraces submission. Philippians 2:8 says, "And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on the cross." You see, humility is not a sign of weakness. When you humble yourself and serve, and I'm not talking about serve someone who can do something for you. I'm talking about serving others when there's nothing in it for you, when there's no gain for you in the natural, but there is in the eyes of God. You see, true humility is found when you're willing to do something for someone else, even if they never recognize that you've ever done it for them to begin with. Humility, when you bend your knee and serve someone, even if they don't deserve it, even if they've mistreated you or spoken harshly to you, if you can still serve them, knowing that you're not just serving them, you're serving the Lord. When you can do that, that's not a sign of weakness. You don't have to be a doormat. Scripture doesn't talk about us being trampled on. Jesus shows us in his demonstration of selflessness, and Jesus shows us with his life on the cross that the greatest form of strength is when you can stand in front of your accusers falsely speaking against you and not feel that you have to say something back. That's not weakness. That's strength of character. That's Jesus in you. And so when people say, oh, you're just weak, no. The greatest strength in your life is when you're willing to serve in humility those who are in greatest need, or those who don't deserve in the natural to have you do one thing on their behalf. That speaks volumes to them about the life of Jesus in you. In order to do that, you have to be secure in who you are. And I'm just going to close with this. I shared some years ago about a time in our lives, the darkest time in our ministry lives, when God had spoken to me. I shared this in a message about waiting on the Lord until he opened the doors of ministry opportunity. It was 2 years. And most of that time I spent working at Best Buy, making a very small wage, serving people in a profession I had never been in sales. But if God said, wait, he said the answer's through Gateway Church. And so every day I would put on that blue Best Buy shirt and those khaki pants. I'd iron those up, put those on, and I'd drive to work. And every day I'd drive by Gateway Church, which is now the building for the King's University, and I'd slow down every day and I'd say, God, you said wait, and you said the answer's through Gateway. And I did it every day, for almost 2 years. When I was standing there at Best Buy in the slow times, I would be thinking to myself, God, why am I in this position? Why am I in this place at Best Buy? Why am I in this? What did I do to get into this wilderness experience? You know, sometimes God takes us to the wilderness, not because we've done wrong, but what he wants to do in us is greater than what we want him to do for us. And I realized in that season that there was a dimension of pride in my life that he was trying to root out so he could use me for greater purposes for his glory. It wasn't a pride and arrogance of looking down on people with haughty eyes, but any time we put ourselves in the position of God, it's a form of pride and arrogance. And what I had done is, the busier I became, the more I relied on my strengths and my talents and my abilities to try and serve the Lord as a pastor in the church for all of those years. But the more it became stressful, the more that I had to work harder, the more I forgot about relying and depending upon the Lord, the more I took it upon myself that I could do this. I didn't say God was not necessary. I just needed to make sure that I did it and I was in control. And God needed to root that out of me. And when you've gone through the wilderness experience, one thing dies in the wilderness. It's pride. You cannot walk in the presence of God through a wilderness experience when you don't have answers, you have more questions than you do answers. You can't walk through that time unless you live and walk in humility. Not to try and elevate myself in any way, but just as a point of closing, as an example for us, a challenge for us to live by. During those years, there was a young man named Chris Kirkendall. He was a part of the church at Gateway. I knew him a little bit. He had served as a youth leader, and so I was familiar with him in that role. But he was really struggling with his whole sense of calling and faith, and he was working at Best Buy with me through that season. And then I was asked to join the staff at Gateway, and it had been some years later, just a few years ago, and I remember that I wanted to frame one of those Best Buy shirts, those blue shirts. I wanted to put it in a frame and hang it on my wall as a reminder of that season of dependence on the Lord and how he brought victory into our lives. And I didn't have one, so I remember calling Chris and saying, hey, Chris, do you have one of those Best Buy shirts left over? And he said, well, yeah. I said, do you mind could I have one? He said, sure. So would you drop it by my office when you have a chance? He said, no problem. And so a few days later, I was out to lunch, and I noticed when I came back, Chris had been by, and he had one of those Best Buy shirts sitting on my desk. But he also had this note with him. And I just want to read it for you, and we'll close. He said, Dear Pastor John, I want to take a few minutes and thank you for your fine example of how to wait when God says to do so. When you told the story of your walk during your season that you went through at Best Buy, I couldn't help but think back to all the mornings we spent working together. Thank you for providing such an excellent example. Never once did I hear a frustrating or discouraging word. I pray that during the most recent experiences walking through a similar waiting season at Best Buy, that I do so with even a tenth of the humility and the strength and the integrity that I saw in you. May God continue to bless you abundantly for all you do for his kingdom. Thanks again for sharing your story. Chris Kirkendall. You see, by that time, Chris had gotten his life straight with the Lord, reconnected with his calling, and was serving as a counselor for wayward youth at a camp, at a retreat center just not far from Dallas. 1 month after he wrote that letter, he was returning back to that campground, took a turn too fast, rolled his vehicle, and died instantly. Now, I don't know that it was of any sense of my example, but I'm so grateful today that I didn't walk through that season at Best Buy, not realizing who else was watching, and do it with bitterness and anger and resentment at what happened in the past, not get mad at God or mad at others, or do it with a sense of dishonor, or work at the minimum level of acceptance, or work with a sense of attitude towards others. I'm so grateful that God brought us through a season of our darkest time in life, but was able to do it with a growing sense of more of him and less of me, a greater sense of dying to myself, of lowering myself, of being willing to do whatever it takes. When God says you need to wait, are you willing to obey his voice even when it doesn't make sense? I'm so grateful for those days that I could be an example to a young man who was looking for someone to show him the way back to Jesus to the deepest way, not knowing that his days were numbered, as all of ours are. God has called us to an attitude change, to descend into greatness by becoming just like Jesus Christ. And it starts with the cross of Calvary, and it starts with an emptied heart, bent knee of surrender to say, God, use me today to manifest your glory through an attitude of humility. I want you to bow your heads with me, if you would, please.